Hello and welcome to my podcast. Get strapped in, we're going to start right away. Today we're going to be talking about disciplinary literacy's connection to culturally relevant pedagogy within a theatrical setting. Disciplinary literacy within the theatrical world primarily focuses on script and or media analysis. Theatrical literacy may come from a watcher's perspective and a producer's, which both contain fundamental skills for any position during a performance or rehearsal process. When engaging with performance art as an audience member, it is essential to understand how aspects of text are applied to visual performance and why. Even if one does not have the script in hand, understanding why specific design, acting, and creative choices are made in relevance to the plot and themes is a form of theatrical literacy within and of itself. Inversely, it is essential for a producer of any performance art in any sense to be able to decipher those cues from within the text and properly translate them to a visual perspective for audience members to interpret. Speaking of, the ability of interpretation is yet another essential skill to theatrical literacy, as art is subjective and many differing opinions aid both an artist's development and the long-standing success of a work. I stand by the fact that art is ever evolving in the time marker of present society, especially when it is theater performed on stage. Interpretation of art are essential anthropologically, but only if properly defended with evidence and fair discourse. Having a unique interpretation or perspective regardless of the position of engagement with performance art and being able to have discourse with substantial evidence about it are what make this field so interesting, impactful, and long-lasting. Art and theater specifically represents the moment it is happening. They, again, are the historians of the present. Theater is one of the most anthropologically influential art forms. To further decipher the framework of theatrical literacy, I will be examining Ifield Community College's framework that specifically focuses on how to review like a critic. This specified framework can also be used generally, which I will prove in reference to the Educational Theater Association's presentation on disciplinary literacy available on their learning guide database. Ifield's reading framework states that the navigation of script structure, reading/memorizing scripted speech, having analytical perspective, encompassing ranged viewpoints, deciphering word problems, contextualizing and understanding specific vocabulary are all essential parts to reading aspects of theatrical literacy. These skills provide a foundational toolkit for engaging with text and being able to make connections as a reader, audience member, and actor. Similarly, many of these skills are foundational aspects of writing in this disciplinary literacy. These include precise vocabulary, analytical writing, justification of claims through evidence, and self-reflections. The ability to self-reflect is the web of what keeps the following foundation, listening/discourse, together, and ultimately forms the fully theatrically literate student. The listening/discourse foundations, according to Ifield's, focus primarily on understanding and usage of specific vocabulary, while also taking into account students' ability to relay reflective writings verbally, which includes the performance of it through projection and diction, of course. The Educational Theater Association cites acting, designing, dramaturgy, writing, and producing as main principles of theater education. Without the foundational skilled Ifield framework suggests, students would not be able to do the even furtherly specific training within these overlapping aspects. EdTA also presents us with the elements of theater, which are storytelling, communication, exploration, research, improv, expression, interpretation, transformation, transition, conversion, and conflict relationship. Again, without the principles and the elements work together alongside the basic foundation that is suggested in Ifield's framework to create theatrical literacy. Now, there are many strategies to build these foundations. However, this literacy is often difficult for students to engage with because of class barriers inherent to the field, i.e. ticket expenses, budget and funding cuts, lack of resources, locations, etc. These issues disproportionately affect future artists of color. Theater is also widely known to be racist and exclusionary towards people of color throughout its history, silencing stories, not allowing actors of color in theatrical spaces, educational and performative alike, and profiting off of white supremacist funding, etc. Theater overall has direct ties to colonialism via significant and often religious propaganda being one of its primary uses by the original architects of the craft, the ancient Greek and Romans. This has been a theme throughout performance history that is still relevant to this day. Even in specific disciplinary training, such as technical acting, there are roots to white supremacy and segregation. In my research, I have found how higher education professionals and theater world professionals are tackling the deficit through an article by Alison Cosadine from American Theater. To be clear, the deficit is of Black bodies, colored stories, etc. Acting theory suffers from what most curricula in the US and even in the world suffers from, which is white supremacy and colonialism, says Luckett, an assistant theater professor at the University of Cincinnati. She goes on to explain how students of color would come to her following technical acting training and want more information on the methods she used in her classroom that were relevant and accessible for their diverse bodies. There was no book for me to give them, she concedes. I always knew that theater began in Africa, so this made me wonder, where's all of that knowledge? It's been hidden, especially in the US, because of racism. Luckett went on to write the incredibly successful book Black Acting Methods, in which her findings are translated and practically accessible for educators and actors alike. These roots of theater encourage a disregard for diversity and inhibit the blossom of creation, which creates a hole in many students' engagement with theater overall, and outwardly denies them this disciplinary literacy because it wishes to make them feel as though these themes, lessons, stories, spaces, and interpretations are not meant for them. Student detachment also stems from a place of irrelevance, as the stories often deal with specific hegemonic issues that many students of color may simply not deal with. This is why teaching with an intersectional perspective is so essential for students who may not be able to engage, learn how to engage, and or want to engage with theater if it were not for an excellent, culturally understanding theater professional. That is why it is up to us educators to ensure that we are actively dismantling these themes of racism in educational settings rather than being complicit in them. The duty of an educator is to ensure equality for their students and to listen to their needs. However, this listening must stay listening, and this duty may not be placed on their shoulders instead, or else the cycle will continue. According to Katja Dunn, an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte's Department of Theater, most importantly, the work of dismantling racism in educational settings must be a priority from the top and not be put onto BIPOC students to carry out. We cannot continue to let generations of Black artists, Latinx artists, Asian American artists, and other BIPOC artists become fodder and experimentation while white faculty try to figure it out. She insists, noting that BIPOC faculty often take on the added role of side mentoring BIPOC students in ways that white professors often do not. So, how do theater educators ensure these fundamentals are established for students so often excluded from the field? Today we will be examining culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining pedagogy for a theater curriculum as it connects to theatrical literacy. As I am philosophically informed by many Black feminist thought that support these methodologies, they stand as a forefront of my being and as an educator. Within this pedagogy, there is often space for classroom management style known as restorative justice that has direct ties to Black feminist ideas with the same name. This is another essential foundation of my philosophy as an educator. To eliminate state and therefore educationally led violence that supports institutions otherwise known as pipelines, directly tied to the oppression of students of color. These pipelines include but are not limited to the school to prison pipeline, the school to military to prison to homelessness pipeline, etc. These epistemologies that focus on decolonization, anti-racism, and genuine equality are essential to filling that hole in education many theater educators and students face. To define these aspects of culturally relevant pedagogy, which was a term coined by Dr. Nicole West Burns in 2008 to encapsulate culturally relevant teaching and culturally responsive teaching. Under one umbrella term, we are going to be taking an interdisciplinary source, ZenEd Math's video. ZenEd Math is based in math education in classrooms, but the pedagogy is translatable to theater as well. Firstly, the video mentions Gloria Ladson-Billings, an essential trailblazer for culturally relevant pedagogy. Billings defines culturally relevant teaching as an approach to teaching that uses students' cultural knowledge and backgrounds, affirming their cultural identity while also assisting them in developing critical perspectives that challenge inequities in schools and other institutions. When speaking of culturally relevant pedagogy, Billings also lays emphasis on collective, not just individual empowerment. It is essential for educators to understand how to adapt curriculum for these diverse backgrounds, perspectives, inequities, and identities. Educators who thoroughly follow these methodologies should also respond to information presented by the students' identities and cultural framework within their content and curriculum. This is known as culturally responsive teaching. Further, Geneva Gay, who is another prominent figure in the developing pedagogy, theorizes that culturally responsive teaching uses students' cultural frame of reference to teach and inform curriculum and content. Gay suggests that teaching is focused on personal and cultural strengths, intellectual capabilities, and prior accomplishments of students. Regardless of methodology, as educators, we are required to adapt a multifaceted curriculum that can be practical for all student success, even as far back as pre-service teachers, as EdTPA does require rationale for differentiation on their lesson plans. Using this methodology will only amplify an educator's ability to do so by acknowledging cultural and identity frameworks, which is culturally relevant teaching, in which the students may exist. This understanding of that ability ensures equality by examining cultural similarities and differences to fully form a cohesive curriculum for all students that may differentiate due to identity framework, which is culturally responsive. In doing so, this makes it culturally relevant pedagogy. According to ZenEd, culturally responsive teachers understand that students' cultures manifest in a variety of ways through their learning preferences. Culturally responsive teachers then specify and differentiate instruction based on the student's cultural framework. However, to ensure an intersectional perspective, as often students of color or lower classes go undiagnosed and misdiagnosed with various learning disabilities, it is important to take into account all aspects of student identities, not just culture, when following these methodologies, which is supported by definition by Gay and Billings both. Another term similar to this is cultural relational teaching, which seeks to encourage educators' understanding of the evolution of cultures over time and uplift the possible meaningful relationships understanding students' cultural framework can bring, according to Paletz. This focus on relation rather than response requires more self-reflection and prior research from an educator. While both focus heavily on self-reflection, this also includes necessary scholarship that should be within us as educators anyway. Another term used in culturally relevant pedagogy is culturally sustaining teaching. According to the Intercultural Development Research Association, otherwise known as IDRA, these practices maintain heritage, values, cultural and linguistic pluralism. It has the explicit goal of sustaining and supporting bi/multilingualism and multiculturalism. Now, pluralism is a condition or system in which multiple states, groups, etc. can coexist. This is the antithesis to dualism that is often deconstructed in Black feminist thought. Dualism suggests a conceptual division between identities and maintains damaging exclusionary institutions in the form of a hegemonic binary. This can be seen through applications of division in all aspects of identity, but prominent examples include man-woman, black and white, nature and humankind. Educators and feminists should work alongside one another theoretically to dismantle these binaries and ensure equal opportunity for all identities. Culturally sustaining teaching is a practical usage of pluralism in the classroom and encourages the melting pot concept consistent with the hypothetical American dream all of us have the right to under the institutions that we are born to in this country, that so often work oppositionally to ensure continuous dualism and maintain division. The IDRA supports the term culturally sustaining educational practices coined by Paris and Lim in 2017 to encapsulate these terms. CSEP's usage of the word practice and emphasizes the need to include curriculum and policy alongside pedagogy and teaching that specific terms may focus on solely. To fully encompass a culturally competent educator, it is in one's best interest to shape their actions in the eyes of all of the practices mentioned rather than just curriculum or policy, teaching, content, and pedagogy separately. To summarize, culturally relevant pedagogy encapsulates specific techniques such as culturally relevant teaching and culturally responsive teaching, whereas the term culturally sustaining teaching practices encapsulates and promotes all of the work done to ensure the dismantlement of the racism and colonialism within educational institutions of all forms. All of these terms can and should coexist to promote the foundational aspects of pluralism from the stem of them. Now that I have thrown a bunch of similar terms at you, let's talk about them working together within your classroom by examining Lorenzo's article based around observations and interviews of a teacher named David. David is a white middle-class third-grade teacher with 28 years of experience. Wanting a challenge, David transferred to Fisher School with an incredibly diverse student body in terms of class and ethnicity. While the cultural differences between David and the student body are, quote, distinct and readily invisible, unquote, his efforts in using theater as an instructional device for full understanding of culture within his classroom are successful. A strategy David often applies is requiring students to write and reflect upon a cultural engagement within their lives outside of the classroom. This allows David insight on their identity frameworks and creates a level of relatability by creating a space for David to connect to his students' lives outside of school personally and authentically. Similarly, David built in time to have these reflections in the form of discourse. All of these activities are essential to theatrical literacy and culturally sustaining teaching practices. David explains that the power of theater lies in these moments of connection, and that theater is the ultimate tool to make classroom learning meaningful for all students. David also uses theater in interdisciplinary work, such as social studies, to encourage the continuous engagement with theatrical literacy overall, as it has many ties to media literacy, etc. David strives to highlight the unique qualities theater allows students to project so proudly to promote positive self-perception and community bonding through positive reinforcement. Again, highlighting the inherent intermingling essentials of both theatrical literacy and culturally relevant pedagogy overall. David applies both culturally relevant teaching and culturally responsive teaching with these techniques. Alongside his classroom work, he focuses on continuing to build these connections outside of school by engaging with similar work in the community. This is culturally sustaining practice and a testament to his dedication as an educator. Now that we have seen some practices David applies within his classroom, I would like to talk about some practices that teachers should apply to themselves. As I have mentioned, an essential skill for educators wishing to follow culturally sustaining practices or culturally relevant pedagogy is reflection. Pletz has suggested the following reflection guide to help build the CRP mindset with guided questions. Number 1, educators must know their learners. Questions include, but are not limited to, how do I develop deep knowledge about individuals to know how they learn best and where they are in their learnings? How do I form strong collaborative relationships? How do I design curriculum that is reflective of student body? And how do I hold asset-based approaches with each learner that foster cultural and linguistic pluralism? Number 2 is holding high expectations. How do I ensure each student is being appropriately challenged? How do I ensure that there is a safe space with the proper type of faculty, or with the proper type of scaffolding, And how do I use a variety of assessments to inform student action as they achieve my high expectations appropriate for them? Third, build cultural competence. How do I present and explicitly share my cultural identity and beliefs in my teaching and allow students to share theirs? How do I build learners' knowledge in the general role culture plays and in specific cultures? How do I support learners in affirming and appreciating their culture of origin while developing fluency in others, which is very important? And how do I help learners navigate differences? Fourth is have a constructivist approach. How do I make learning an active process? How do I support students to make sense of new learning? How do I leverage curiosity? And how do I acknowledge learners' differences and leverage them as resources to support learning rather than as roadblocks? Number 5, educators must be able to develop critical consciousness. Questions include, how do I allow learners to analyze systems, structures, especially those that result in inequities, to solve authentic real-world problems? How do I provide opportunities for learners to question and critique societal norms that are not inclusive? How do I create a space for discussion and reflection to generate a sense of efficacy for change against oppressive conditions? And lastly, educators must have a desire to make a difference. How do I commit to being a change agent to make education more equitable for all learners? How do I work to remove existing barriers? And how do I teach my students that who they are and how they treat others is just as, if not more, important than what they know? All of these reflective questions allow teachers insight to their own thought process in ways that maybe you didn't even know. A lot of people have implicit bias, and that is a huge problem within the education field. And these guided questions following CRP can really help reframe the way that educators view their students and also how they interact with them, how they teach them. Asking yourself questions and reflecting on the work you do is the only way to model that behavior for your students going forward. Now that we have addressed some general strategies in and outside of the classroom, let's dissect some actual lesson plans and curriculum. In my practicum experience this semester, I created a curriculum that focused on connection throughout the school year via homeroom-style involvement from randomly selected students and faculty. Within it, there is a holiday celebration in which I wanted students to engage with rituals, holidays, etc. outside of their familiarity, because I was not teaching at a very diverse school. In my research, I found this culturally responsive lesson plan by NYU doctoral candidate Lauren, that can be used in any theater classroom or general classroom. As previously mentioned, theater spaces and activities are almost always the connection between us all, and the connection between literacy and CRP. This lesson aims to have students develop concrete ideas for connecting the essence of family rituals to their classroom process. The warm-up activity is called Fruit Salad, and it is essentially a cultural musical chairs. Students share experiences that they are comfortable with that may be unknown to the other students, and then have to essentially musical chair and hope they get a chair if they have also experienced that. The second activity, the main activity, is to write your favorite family ritual on an index card. Each ritual should be explained in 3 sentences. For example, this could be having corned beef and cabbage on St. Patrick's Day. In small groups, participants will share one of their index cards, and then eventually groups will create one classroom ritual that combines the concepts within the groups into the classroom. Lastly, each small group will present and teach their ritual to the entire group, and rituals can be kept in reference in the classroom and used throughout the year. I think this is a wonderful way for both Lauren to get insight into their identity frameworks and then adapt her space alongside her curriculum and other practices within the classroom, as well as giving the students opportunity to engage with other cultures and giving the students the opportunity to be positively reinforced on their own culture, building that efficacy I mentioned earlier, and building that positive authenticity that theater classrooms so often can bring. To reflect on the research journey, I first have to mention how a lot of these things, such as strategies, ideas, methodologies, were things I was already instinctually doing as an educator. Now, this may come from my personal diverse background of only going to Title I schools, where most of the time I was the poor white girl. This created sort of a challenge in this process. As is suggested by this pedagogy that supports theatrical literacy and supports educators overall, we should lead with empathy, even if that means with disagreeing peoples. I have found many disagreeing peoples on the topic of this research, and that really frustrates me. I am a firm believer that if you had to unlearn racism or reframe your mind in major ways to be able to apply this pedagogy to your discipline, then you're probably not in the right place. I believe that educators should actively be anti-racist and should actively work to equalize opportunity for students overall. However, because I aim to be culturally understanding and lead with empathy, I have done reflection on that, and so I offer this podcast. I hope that this podcast comes in terms of non-condescending and in terms of, hey, you want to learn something? We all can work together to dismantle these institutions, as long as we stand in solidarity and understanding of each other and have the patience to teach teachers. In conclusion, I plan to use culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally sustaining educational practices in my classroom going forward because of their inherent connection, I have learned, to theatrical literacy. A lot of these strategies required in CRP are things that we naturally have to do within the proper curriculum framework as theater educators. The two are consistently intermingling and should be highlighted as one force rather than separate entities. This connection fosters authenticity in student performance and engagement overall. Theatrical literacy is incredibly important, and CRP only supports it. Thank you.